April the 12th, 1945. The afternoon light filtered through the windows of the little White House in Warm Springs, Georgia. Franklin Delano Roosevelt sat for what would be his final portrait, unaware that in mere hours, the course of American history would pivot on a single devastating moment. At precisely 1:15 p.m., the President of the United States complained of a terrible headache, pressed his hand to the back of his skull, and collapsed forward in his chair. By 3:35 that afternoon, Roosevelt was dead. But this isn't really a story about Roosevelt's death. This is the story of what happened next. A story of two men who inherited FDR's legacy and proceeded to tear it apart in one of the most spectacular political explosions in American history. A story of idealism versus pragmatism, of trust versus suspicion, of a firing that would reshape the entire world order for the next half-century. Most Americans today have never heard of Henry Wallace. They should have. 6 months before Roosevelt's death, Wallace had been Vice President of the United States. He'd been the second most powerful person in America, Roosevelt's chosen successor, the man millions of Democrats believed would carry the New Deal into the post-war era. Instead, he became the first cabinet member in history to be fired for being too soft on Stalin. The man who fired him was Harry Truman, a former haberdasher from Missouri who'd been vice president for exactly 82 days when Roosevelt died. Truman knew virtually nothing about foreign policy. He'd been deliberately excluded from Roosevelt's inner circle. He didn't even know about the atomic bomb until after he became president. Yet within 18 months, this political novice would make a decision that defined the Cold War before most people even knew there was going to be a Cold War. The collision between Truman and Wallace wasn't personal. It was philosophical. These two men looked at the same post-war world and saw completely different realities. Wallace saw an opportunity for unprecedented cooperation between America and the Soviet Union. Truman saw a threat that required immediate containment. One vision promised lasting peace through understanding. The other promised security through strength. History would prove one of them catastrophically wrong. To understand how we got to that explosive September morning in 1946 when Truman demanded Wallace's resignation, we need to go back to the beginning, back to a time when Henry Wallace wasn't just another politician, but one of the most influential men in America. Henry Agard Wallace was born into American agricultural royalty on October 7, 1888 in Iowa. His grandfather had founded Wallace's Farmer magazine. His father had served as Secretary of Agriculture under 2 Republican presidents. Young Henry inherited more than just the family business. He inherited a passion for scientific farming that would revolutionize American agriculture. By 1910, Wallace had graduated from Iowa State College and taken over editing the family magazine. But editing wasn't enough for him. Between 1913 and 1933, Wallace conducted groundbreaking experiments in corn breeding. His work wasn't theoretical. It was practical science that would eventually help feed millions of people around the world. In 1926, he founded the High-Bred Corn Company, the first business to market high-yield, disease-resistant hybrid corn for commercial sale. Wallace's innovations caught the attention of Franklin Roosevelt, who appointed him Secretary of Agriculture in 1933. Wallace was 44 years old and about to implement some of the most controversial policies of the New Deal. The Agricultural Adjustment Act involved deliberately destroying crops and livestock to prevent overproduction and stabilize farm prices. In a nation where 25% of Americans were unemployed, destroying food seemed insane to many people. Wallace received death threats. Farmers protested in the streets. But the policy worked. Farm prices rebounded. Rural America stabilized. Wallace became one of Roosevelt's most trusted advisors. In 1940, when Roosevelt decided to run for an unprecedented third term, he needed a new running mate. His current vice president, John Nance Garner, had broken with Roosevelt over the New Deal's expansion. Roosevelt chose Wallace. The selection shocked the Democratic establishment. Wallace had limited political experience outside agriculture. He was seen as too liberal, too idealistic, too much of a dreamer. Opposition to his nomination at the Democratic Convention was so fierce that Wallace didn't even deliver an acceptance speech. But Roosevelt insisted, and with the president's backing, Wallace secured the nomination. As vice president from 1941 to 1945, Wallace's influence grew dramatically. When America entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt expanded Wallace's responsibilities far beyond the ceremonial duties typically assigned to vice presidents. Wallace became a member of Roosevelt's War Cabinet. He chaired the Board of Economic Warfare, responsible for procuring strategically important materials from around the world. Roosevelt sent him on diplomatic missions to Latin America, China, and the Soviet Union. Wallace had a vision that extended far beyond wartime necessity. He called it the century of the common man. In a famous speech delivered on May 8, 1942 at the Free World Association in New York, Wallace laid out his philosophy. The war wasn't just about defeating the Nazis. It was about creating a new world order based on global peace, prosperity, and equality. Common people everywhere, not just elites and corporations, would share in the world's resources and opportunities. The speech resonated with millions of Americans. Wallace became wildly popular with liberal Democrats, labor unions, and progressive activists. But popularity with the base meant opposition from the establishment. Conservative Democrats, especially from the South, despised his liberal views on economics and race. Business leaders opposed his populist policies. Most damaging was his bitter bureaucratic war with Jesse Jones, the conservative Secretary of Commerce. Roosevelt, exhausted by the infighting, dissolved Wallace's Board of Economic Warfare in 1943. It was Wallace's first major political defeat, but it wouldn't be his last. By 1944, everyone close to Roosevelt knew the president was dying, though few said it publicly. Roosevelt suffered from severe hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and congestive heart failure. His doctors privately gave him less than a year to live. They were almost exactly right. The question of who would be vice president in Roosevelt's fourth term wasn't theoretical. It was a practical question about who would become president of the United States, probably within months. Democratic Party leaders panicked at the thought of Henry Wallace in the Oval Office. They considered him too liberal, too sympathetic to labor unions, too friendly to the Soviet Union, too unpredictable. Conservative Democrats feared his support for racial equality. Business leaders feared his economic populism. Most damaging was the perception that Wallace was naive about Stalin and the Soviet threat. The perception wasn't entirely unfair. In May 1944, Wallace had embarked on a goodwill tour of Soviet Siberia, visiting about 20 cities over several weeks. What he saw during that trip, or more accurately, what he was allowed to see, would haunt him for years. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, had prepared for Wallace's visit by staging elaborate deceptions. The most notorious was at Magadan, a slave labor camp in northeastern Siberia, where thousands of political prisoners worked in brutal conditions. The NKVD transformed Magadan into a Potemkin village for Wallace's visit. They brought in actors and NKVD officers to play the role of happy workers. They staged demonstrations of supposedly voluntary labor. They created fake dormitories with comfortable beds and good food. They hid all evidence of the Gulag system. Wallace, completely fooled, was enormously impressed. He wrote in his trip report that Magadan was like a combination of the Tennessee Valley Authority and Hudson's Bay Company, a model of productive cooperation between government and enterprise. The comment would be quoted against him for the rest of his life. At the Democratic Convention in Chicago in July 1944, party bosses launched a coordinated campaign to dump Wallace from the ticket. Robert Hannigan, the Democratic National Committee chairman, led the effort. Big city political machines, Southern segregationist Democrats, and conservative business interests all worked together to block Wallace's renomination. Roosevelt, too exhausted and too ill to fight them, eventually acquiesced. He told party leaders he would be happy with Wallace as his running mate, but if they wanted someone else, he'd also be happy with Supreme Court Justice William Douglas or Senator Harry Truman of Missouri. Roosevelt's unwillingness to fight for Wallace sealed the outcome. The party bosses immediately chose Truman, a moderate senator from a border state who offended nobody and had solid credentials as chairman of the Senate committee investigating war production waste. On the convention floor, Wallace's supporters staged a passionate but ultimately futile fight. When Wallace gave his speech seconding Roosevelt's nomination, the crowd erupted with genuine enthusiasm. For 40 minutes, the convention hall shook with pro-Wallace demonstration. If the vote for vice president had been held at that moment, Wallace might have won. But the convention leadership quickly adjourned for the night, preventing any vote. By the next day, the bosses had the votes lined up for Truman. Wallace was out. Truman was in. The Roosevelt-Truman ticket won the November 1944 election in a landslide. On January 20, 1945, Wallace administered the oath of office to Truman as vice president, the man who had replaced him. Wallace believed party leaders had stolen the nomination from him. He was right. Roosevelt, perhaps feeling guilty about abandoning Wallace, offered him any cabinet position except Secretary of State. Wallace asked for Secretary of Commerce. Roosevelt agreed. After contentious Senate hearings where conservatives attacked Wallace's liberal policies, he was confirmed in March 1945. Wallace expected to play a major role in transitioning the American economy from wartime to peacetime production. He had plans for massive public works projects, expanded social programs, and international economic cooperation that would prevent another depression. 23 days later, everything changed. When the news reached Harry Truman that afternoon in April, he was having a bourbon with House Speaker Sam Rayburn in the Capitol building. The call came at 5:10. No details, just an urgent message to come to the White House immediately. Truman sensed something catastrophic had happened, but nothing could have prepared him for Eleanor Roosevelt's words when he arrived. "Harry, the president is dead." Truman's first thought wasn't about becoming president. It was concern for the woman who had just lost her husband of 40 years. He asked if there was anything he could do for her. Eleanor Roosevelt looked at him with a mixture of compassion and worry. "Is there anything we can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now." She was absolutely right. Truman was spectacularly unprepared for what was about to happen. Roosevelt had kept him at arm's length during his 82 days as vice president. They'd had almost no substantive conversations about war strategy, foreign policy, or post-war planning. Truman didn't know about the Manhattan Project. He didn't know about the agreements Roosevelt had made with Stalin and Churchill at Yalta 2 months earlier. He had been deliberately excluded from the inner circle of Roosevelt's wartime leadership. At 7:09 that evening, Chief Justice Harlan Stone administered the presidential oath of office to Harry Truman in the cabinet room of the White House. When Stone finished, Truman looked around at the men who had served Roosevelt for years and said something that revealed his deep insecurity about the moment. "Boys, if you ever pray, pray for me now. I don't know if you fellows ever had a load of hay fall on you, but when they told me yesterday what had happened, I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me." The cabinet members reassured him they would help. They would provide continuity. Truman asked them all to stay in their positions. He needed experienced advisors who understood Roosevelt's policies, who had relationships with Allied leaders, who could help him navigate the final months of the war and the emerging challenges of peace. Truman kept most of Roosevelt's cabinet, including Wallace as Secretary of Commerce. But keeping Wallace would prove to be one of the most consequential mistakes of Truman's presidency. The two men had fundamentally different views about the Soviet Union, and that difference would destroy their relationship and reshape American foreign policy for generations. The wartime alliance between America, Britain and the Soviet Union had always been fragile, held together only by the common enemy of Nazi Germany. Even before the war ended, cracks were appearing. Soviet troops occupied Eastern Europe as they pushed the Germans back toward Berlin. Stalin showed no intention of allowing free elections in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, or Czechoslovakia. Soviet-supported communist parties seized power. Opposition politicians disappeared or were executed. In February 1946, diplomat George Kennan sent his famous long telegram from the American embassy in Moscow. Kennan, who had served in the Soviet Union for years, warned that Stalin's regime would never cooperate peacefully with the West. Soviet ideology demanded hostility toward capitalism. The Kremlin viewed the world as inherently divided between socialism and capitalism and believed conflict was inevitable. The only language the Soviet Union understood, Kennan argued, was strength. America needed a policy of containment, using political, economic, and, if necessary, military power to prevent Soviet expansion. Truman read the long telegram. So did Secretary of State James Burns. They found Kennan's analysis convincing. By early 1946, Truman was moving toward a harder line against the Soviet Union. Henry Wallace disagreed completely. Wallace believed Stalin's aggression stemmed from fear, not ideology. The Soviet Union had lost between 20 and 27 million people during World War II. Soviet cities had been destroyed. The Soviet economy was devastated. Stalin feared another invasion from the West. His occupation of Eastern Europe was defensive, not aggressive. If America treated the Soviet Union with respect, recognized their legitimate security interests, and offered economic cooperation, Stalin would reciprocate. Confrontation would only provoke Stalin and lead to another war. Wallace began writing letters to Truman, urging a softer approach. On July 23, 1946, Wallace sent Truman a 12-page letter laying out his concerns. Wallace wrote that American military buildup, atomic bomb testing, and support for anti-Soviet governments in Eastern Europe were making Stalin paranoid. America should recognize Soviet spheres of influence in Eastern Europe, just as the Soviets recognized American influence in Latin America. The letter urged Truman to build mutual trust and confidence with the Soviet Union. Truman read the letter. He didn't respond directly. He filed it away. The president was moving in exactly the opposite direction. Secretary of State James Burns was in Paris negotiating peace treaties with former Axis powers. The Paris Peace Conference, which began July 29, 1946, brought together foreign ministers from 21 nations. Burns represented the United States. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov represented the USSR. The negotiations were tense. Every issue, from Italian reparations to the future of Germany, became a proxy battle between East and West. Burns had been one of Roosevelt's closest advisors. He'd served as a Supreme Court justice, then resigned to become Roosevelt's Director of War Mobilization, essentially the domestic czar of the American war effort. Many people, including Burns himself, had expected Roosevelt to choose Burns as his running mate in 1944 instead of Truman or Wallace. When Roosevelt chose Truman, Burns felt betrayed. But Truman, recognizing Burns's experience and wanting to heal old wounds, appointed him Secretary of State in July 1945. By September 1946, Burns was exhausted. The Paris negotiations were going nowhere. Molotov blocked every American proposal. Stalin was testing Truman's resolve. Burns needed unified support from Washington to strengthen his negotiating position. On September 6, 1946, Burns traveled to Stuttgart, Germany, and delivered a major policy speech. The Stuttgart speech marked a fundamental shift in American policy. Burns announced that the United States would not allow Germany to be permanently weakened or divided. Germany needed to rebuild its economy. German industrial capacity would not be limited to prevent rearmament. Instead, Germany would be integrated into a democratic, prosperous Western Europe. The speech was a direct repudiation of Soviet demands to keep Germany weak and divided. Stalin was furious. Soviet propaganda denounced the Stuttgart speech as American imperialism. Molotov accused Burns of abandoning wartime agreements made at Yalta and Potsdam. The Paris negotiations became even more hostile. Then Henry Wallace decided to give a speech of his own. The National Citizens Political Action Committee and the Independent Citizens Committee of the Arts, Sciences, and Professions were left-wing organizations that supported Wallace. They scheduled a major rally at Madison Square Garden in New York for September 12, 1946. The rally, billed as a peace event, was designed to energize liberal Democrats before the November midterm elections. The organizers wanted a major speaker who could articulate a progressive vision for America's role in the post-war world. They invited Henry Wallace. Wallace accepted. He would speak about foreign policy and peace. What he was about to say would trigger the most spectacular cabinet crisis in modern American history and set the stage for the Cold War that would define the next half-century of global politics. Wallace drafted his speech in late August and early September. The speech, titled "The Way to Peace," laid out his vision for American-Soviet relations. Wallace sent the draft to President Truman on September 9th, 3 days before the scheduled delivery. He asked Truman to review it. Truman's schedule on September 9th was packed. He had back-to-back meetings with foreign dignitaries, congressional leaders, and military officials. Wallace's secretary called the White House and said the secretary needed 15 minutes with the president. Truman's staff squeezed Wallace into the schedule at 4:30 in the afternoon. Wallace arrived at the Oval Office carrying his speech. He told Truman he was giving a major address on foreign policy at Madison Square Garden in 3 days. He wanted the president's approval. Truman asked how long the speech was. Wallace said about 30 minutes. Truman looked at his watch. He had another meeting scheduled in 20 minutes. He told Wallace he couldn't read the entire speech right now, but Wallace could read him the key sections. Wallace stood in the Oval Office and read excerpts from his speech. He read the sections that criticized American policy toward the Soviet Union. He read the sections calling for recognition of Soviet spheres of influence in Eastern Europe. He read the sections warning that American military buildup was provoking Stalin. Truman barely listened. He was thinking about his next meeting. He was exhausted. He just wanted Wallace to finish so he could move on to the next item on his schedule. When Wallace finished reading, Truman said the speech sounded fine. He said Wallace could tell reporters that the president had approved it. Truman made a catastrophic mistake. He hadn't actually read the speech carefully. He didn't realize how directly it contradicted Burns's speech and current American policy. He just wanted Wallace out of his office. What happened next would destroy Henry Wallace's political career, split the Democratic Party, and launch the Cold War in earnest. The collision between idealism and pragmatism was about to explode in the most public way possible. September 12, 1946. Evening, Madison Square Garden, New York City. The arena was filling rapidly with thousands of people streaming through the entrances. They came from all over New York and the surrounding states. Labor union members carrying banners, progressive activists wearing buttons, liberal Democrats clutching pamphlets, Communist Party sympathizers holding signs with pro-Soviet slogans. This wasn't your typical Democratic Party rally. The atmosphere felt electric, but strange, almost dangerous. The crowd had come to hear one man, Henry Wallace, the former vice president, the current Secretary of Commerce, the man who dared to challenge President Truman's foreign policy. They believed Wallace would lead them to a new era of peace and cooperation with the Soviet Union. They were about to witness political suicide. Wallace took the podium just after 8 p.m. The crowd erupted. They chanted his name. They waved signs reading, "Peace with Russia," and no war with Stalin. For several minutes, the noise was deafening. Wallace stood at the microphone waiting for quiet. His speech in front of him, 37 typed pages that would end his career in government forever. Wallace wasn't a firebrand speaker. He was a policy intellectual, trying to explain complex foreign relations to a passionate crowd. His voice was calm, measured, reasonable. He talked about the dangers of war in the atomic age. He said the price of peace for America and every nation in the world was giving up prejudice, hatred, fear, and ignorance. The crowd applauded politely. It sounded good, idealistic, and hopeful. Then Wallace moved to the controversial sections. He said American foreign policy toward the Soviet Union was too harsh, too confrontational, too likely to provoke another war. He declared that the United States had no more business in the political affairs of Eastern Europe than Russia had in the political affairs of Latin America, Western Europe, and the United States. He said America should recognize Soviet spheres of influence as legitimate. The communist sympathizers in the crowd roared approval. They stood and cheered. They chanted support for the Soviet Union. But then something unexpected happened. Wallace criticized Soviet suppression of civil liberties. He criticized religious persecution in the Soviet Union. He said the Soviet government needed to allow more freedom for its people. The crowd booed. They actually booed Henry Wallace, the man they'd come to support, because he dared to criticize Stalin. Wallace was visibly shocked. He pressed on, trying to present a balanced view of Soviet-American relations. But the crowd made it clear they wanted unconditional support for the Soviet Union, not nuanced analysis. They wanted propaganda, not policy discussion. Wallace finished his speech after speaking for just over half an hour. The crowd gave him a standing ovation, but it was complicated. They loved his criticism of American policy. They hated his criticism of Soviet policy. Wallace left the stage confused about how his message had been received. He would find out soon enough. The real crisis wasn't happening in the arena. It was happening in Washington and Paris. At exactly 6:15 that evening, 3 hours before Wallace took the stage, President Truman held his regularly scheduled press conference at the White House. Reporters immediately asked about Wallace's upcoming speech. They knew Wallace was giving a major foreign policy address and wanted to know if the president approved it. Truman, remembering his brief meeting with Wallace 3 days earlier, said yes. He had read the speech. He approved it entirely. A reporter asked if that meant the speech represented official administration policy. Truman said yes again. He approved the speech in its entirety. The reporters rushed out to file their stories. Within an hour, newspapers across America reported that President Truman had approved Wallace's speech calling for conciliation with the Soviet Union. The story hit European newswires immediately. By the time Wallace actually delivered his speech in New York, foreign governments already believed it represented official American policy. In Paris, James Burns learned about the Wallace speech and Truman's press conference endorsement from reporters at 2 a.m. Paris time. Burns was stunned. He had just delivered the Stuttgart speech 6 days earlier, laying out a firm policy toward Germany and the Soviet Union. Now Wallace, a cabinet member, was publicly contradicting that policy, and Truman had approved it. Foreign ministers at the Paris Peace Conference were confused. Which policy represented America's actual position? Burns's hardline approach or Wallace's conciliation? Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, saw an opportunity. He told other delegates that America's position was divided and weak. Burns's negotiating position collapsed overnight. Burns cabled Truman immediately. The message was blunt and desperate. Burns said Wallace's speech was undermining American foreign policy at the worst possible moment. If the president supported Wallace's position, Burns would resign as Secretary of State immediately. Truman couldn't have both. He had to choose. When Truman woke up on the morning of September 13th, the first thing his staff brought him was Burns's cable from Paris. Truman read it over breakfast in the White House residence. The full weight of his mistake hit him like a physical blow. He had approved Wallace's speech without reading it carefully. He had told reporters it represented administration policy without understanding what Wallace was actually saying. He had undermined his own Secretary of State during the most sensitive negotiations since the war ended. He had created a foreign policy disaster through carelessness and poor judgment. Truman immediately called his press secretary, Charlie Ross, into his office. He asked Ross to get him the full text of Wallace's speech. Ross brought him a typed copy that had been distributed to the press the night before. Truman read it carefully for the first time. With every paragraph, his anger grew. Wallace had criticized the get-tough policy toward the Soviet Union. Wallace had suggested America should recognize Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. Wallace had implied that Stalin's aggression was America's fault for being too militaristic. Every sentence contradicted what Burns was trying to accomplish in Paris. The newspapers that morning were brutal. Editorial writers across the political spectrum attacked Truman as confused, weak, and incompetent. How could the president not know what his own foreign policy was? How could he approve a speech that contradicted his Secretary of State? How could he claim to be leading America when his own cabinet was in open revolt? Conservative newspapers demanded Wallace's immediate firing. Liberal newspapers demanded that Truman clarify his position and stop flip-flopping. Republicans smelled blood in the water and prepared to make foreign policy confusion a major issue in the upcoming midterm elections. Everyone agreed the situation was a complete mess. Truman tried damage control. On September 14th, 2 days after the Madison Square Garden speech, he held another press conference. He attempted to walk back his earlier statement. A reporter asked if he still approved of Wallace's speech. Truman said there had been a misunderstanding. When he told reporters 2 days earlier that he approved the speech, he meant only that he approved Wallace's right to give it, not necessarily the content or the policy positions. The explanation convinced nobody in the room. The reporters knew exactly what Truman had said on September 12th. He'd been asked directly if the speech represented administration policy, and he'd said yes. Now he was claiming he'd meant something different. The credibility gap was enormous and growing by the hour. Truman received a second cable from Burns on September 15th. This message was even more blunt than the first. Burns wrote that he couldn't continue serving as Secretary of State if cabinet members openly contradicted foreign policy and the president backed them. The damage in Paris was severe. Foreign ministers didn't know what American policy actually was. Negotiations had stalled completely. Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov was exploiting the confusion to make demands he knew Burns couldn't meet. Burns's ultimatum was crystal clear. Either Wallace goes or I go. Choose now. Truman faced an impossible political calculation. Burns was his Secretary of State, the face of American diplomacy, the lead negotiator with the Soviet Union. Losing Burns would cripple American foreign policy at the most critical moment since Pearl Harbor. But Wallace was enormously popular with liberal Democrats and labor unions. Firing Wallace would split the Democratic Party just 7 weeks before crucial midterm elections. Democrats were already facing potential losses. A public fight between Truman and Wallace would guarantee disaster. Truman tried a compromise solution. On September 16th, he called Wallace to the White House for a private meeting. Truman said Wallace could keep his position as Secretary of Commerce, but he had to stop speaking about foreign policy entirely. No more speeches, no more public statements, no more interviews about international affairs. Wallace asked if that was an order or a request. Truman said it was a direct order from the President of the United States. Wallace said he would comply. For exactly 2 days, Truman thought he'd solved the crisis without political bloodshed. But the newspapers wouldn't let the story die. Editorial after editorial demanded Wallace's resignation. Republicans attacked Truman as weak and indecisive. Conservative Democrats joined the chorus, calling for Wallace's head. Burns sent another cable from Paris saying he couldn't function as Secretary of State with Wallace still in the cabinet, even if Wallace promised to stay silent. The damage to American credibility was already done. On September 18th, Truman held a marathon meeting with Wallace at the White House that lasted 2.5 hours. Truman later wrote in his diary that Wallace spent the entire time defending his speech and explaining why American policy toward the Soviet Union was fundamentally wrong. Wallace showed no willingness to compromise or moderate his views. He truly believed Stalin could be trusted if America would just treat the Soviet Union fairly and with respect. Wallace argued that Burns's Stuttgart speech had been unnecessarily provocative. He insisted that recognizing Soviet security interests in Eastern Europe wasn't appeasement, it was realism. He claimed that American military buildup and atomic bomb testing were forcing Stalin into defensive positions that looked aggressive to Western observers. Wallace genuinely believed that accommodation was possible, that the wartime alliance could continue into peacetime if both sides showed good faith. Truman went home that evening and wrote extensively in his diary. He wrote that he'd been left in a terrible position by his own mistake in approving the speech without reading it carefully. He wrote that cabinet members should stay in their own areas of responsibility and stop interfering with each other's departments. He wrote that Wallace had a habit of thinking he knew better than everyone else on every subject from agriculture to atomic energy to international relations. Most importantly, Truman wrote that he was beginning to understand the fundamental impossibility of the situation. Wallace wasn't just disagreeing with specific policies. He was disagreeing with the entire direction of American foreign policy. Wallace wanted accommodation with Stalin. Truman was moving toward containment. Wallace wanted to trust Soviet intentions. Truman was learning to distrust Soviet actions. The gap between their worldviews wasn't bridgeable through compromise or discussion. On September 19th, Truman called his advisors together for a final strategy session. They discussed options methodically. Everyone agreed Wallace had to go. The question was how to minimize the political damage. Clark Clifford, Truman's counsel, suggested having Wallace submit a resignation letter to make it look mutual rather than a firing. Make it about policy differences rather than personal conflict. Minimize the spectacle as much as possible. But even Truman's advisors knew the political cost would be enormous. Wallace wasn't just another cabinet member. He represented Roosevelt's liberal legacy. Firing him would be seen as a betrayal of the New Deal coalition that had elected Truman. Liberal Democrats would be furious. Labor unions would feel abandoned. Progressive activists would view Truman as a conservative usurper who'd stolen the presidency that rightfully belonged to Wallace. The decision would define Truman's presidency and determine whether he could build his own political coalition independent of Roosevelt's shadow. Everything was about to change, and everyone in that room knew it. On the morning of September 20th, 1946, President Harry Truman sat alone in the Oval Office, morning light filtering through the tall windows behind his desk. Before him lay a single sheet of paper, a resignation letter, pre-written, waiting for a signature. The decision had been made. Henry Wallace had to go. The door opened at precisely 10:23 a.m. Wallace walked in, age 57, former vice president under Franklin Roosevelt, current Secretary of Commerce for exactly 8 more minutes. Wallace had known this meeting was coming. Everyone in Washington knew. The newspapers had been demanding his head for a week. Editorial writers called him naive, dangerous, a Soviet sympathizer. What most Americans watching this political drama unfold didn't understand was that this wasn't really about one speech at Madison Square Garden. This wasn't about one mistake at one rally. This was the culmination of 18 months of rising tension between two men who had inherited Roosevelt's legacy and disagreed fundamentally about what that legacy meant. They represented two completely different visions for America's role in the post-war world. One vision would shape the next 45 years of global politics, creating the framework for containment, NATO, the Marshall Plan, and everything that became known as the Cold War. The other vision would be relegated to the footnotes of history, remembered mainly as a cautionary tale about naivety in dealing with totalitarian regimes. Truman looked across his desk at Wallace and spoke directly. "Henry, I need your resignation." The words hung in the air between them. There was no small talk, no pretense of consultation. The situation had become impossible. Secretary of State James Burns couldn't function with Wallace in the cabinet. The president couldn't have two foreign policies running simultaneously. Wallace, according to Truman's later notes, was surprisingly gracious about it. He didn't argue. He didn't fight. He didn't demand explanations or try to negotiate a compromise. He simply nodded, took out a pen, and signed the resignation letter he'd prepared the night before. The letter was brief and dignified. Wallace wrote that he was resigning because of fundamental disagreements about foreign policy toward the Soviet Union. At exactly 11 hours a.m., the White House issued a statement to the press. President Truman had requested and received the resignation of Secretary of Commerce Henry Wallace due to irreconcilable differences over foreign policy direction. The firing had taken exactly 8 days from the Madison Square Garden speech to Wallace's departure from the cabinet. The liberal wing of the Democratic Party exploded in fury. Labor unions denounced Truman as a betrayer of Roosevelt's legacy. Progressive activists accused the president of abandoning the common man for Wall Street interests. Letters poured into the White House from angry Democrats threatening to bolt the party. The political coalition that had elected Roosevelt 4 times was fracturing in real time. Eleanor Roosevelt, still the most respected voice in liberal Democratic circles, was privately disappointed but didn't publicly criticize Truman. She understood the foreign policy realities, even if she sympathized with Wallace's idealism. Her measured response helped contain some of the liberal backlash, but the damage was extensive and lasting. Wallace immediately became a martyr to the progressive left. He took over as editor of the New Republic magazine and used it as a platform to attack Truman's foreign policy every week. Every issue featured Wallace editorials denouncing the Cold War, criticizing military spending, and arguing for cooperation with Stalin. The magazine's circulation soared as Wallace became the voice of Americans who believed accommodation with the Soviet Union was still possible. In December 1946, just 3 months after his firing, Wallace helped found the Progressive Citizens of America, a left-wing organization that would become the foundation for his 1948 presidential campaign. The group brought together labor unions, civil rights activists, communist sympathizers, and progressive intellectuals who felt abandoned by Truman's rightward drift on foreign policy. Wallace announced in December 1947 that he would run against Truman as a third-party candidate representing the Progressive Party. The 1948 presidential election was shaping up to be one of the strangest in American history. Truman faced challenges from both left and right. Wallace would run attacking Truman's Cold War policies from the left. Strom Thurmond, the segregationist Democratic governor of South Carolina, would run as a Dixiecrat attacking Truman's civil rights policies from the right. Republican Thomas Dewey, confident of victory against a divided Democratic Party, ran a cautious campaign, avoiding specific commitments. Every poll showed Dewey winning easily. Political analysts wrote Truman's political obituary months before Election Day. The president's support was fragmenting in every direction. Wallace was pulling liberal votes. Thurmond was pulling Southern votes. Dewey had the moderate middle locked up. September 20th, 1946 marked more than just a cabinet resignation. It marked the moment when America chose its path for the next half-century. The firing of Henry Wallace wasn't just a personnel decision. It was a choice between accommodation and containment, between trusting Stalin's intentions and preparing for Soviet expansion, between Roosevelt's wartime optimism and Truman's post-war realism. History proved Truman right. though at enormous cost. The Cold War that Wallace wanted to prevent lasted 45 years. The policy of containment that George Kennan recommended and Truman implemented eventually worked. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Eastern Europe won its freedom. Democracy spread across the globe. But the price was decades of nuclear terror, proxy wars, and global division. Wallace's vision of cooperation wasn't entirely wrong. His dream of a world where great powers work together instead of competing remains an ideal worth pursuing. But his faith in Stalin's good intentions was catastrophically misplaced. The man who had staged Potemkin villages for Wallace's Siberian tour would never have reciprocated American trust with Soviet cooperation. The tragedy is that both men wanted the same thing. Both wanted peace. Both wanted prosperity. Both wanted democracy to prevail. They simply disagreed about how to achieve those goals. Truman believed strength would deter aggression. Wallace believed kindness would encourage cooperation. In the end, Stalin responded to strength, not kindness. That September morning when Wallace walked out of the Oval Office, his political career was finished. But Truman's presidency was just beginning. The man who had felt like the moon, stars, and planets had fallen on him in April 1945 had finally found his footing. He would go on to win the 1948 election against all odds, vindicate his foreign policy, and establish America as the leader of the free world. Sometimes history turns on the smallest moments. A hurried meeting in the Oval Office, a speech approved without proper review, a firing that seemed like political suicide but became the foundation of American global leadership. That's how the world actually changes, not through grand plans or inevitable forces, but through human decisions made under pressure by imperfect people trying to do what they think is right.